Hi, so thanks for coming out today. Again, my name is Rob Hunt, and I'm with Tuatara Capital. First of all, it's always an honor to go after Ian Sieb. It's an ongoing joke with Ian and I that I often get to take the stage after him, which is always humbling for me because if you don't know Ian's background, he goes through it in a very quiet way, but what Ian's done for this industry is really impressive. And as a former chairman of NCIA and still a board member of NCIA, I echo what he said, and I encourage everyone in this room to become a member of NCIA and get involved because it's that organization, as well as a few others, that allow things like this to happen. And the laws that get changed in the United States are a direct result of the work that people like Ian put in. So again, Ian, thank you for all your work. So the discussion I have today is really talking about cannabis at the crossroads. In 1996, California led the charge of creating a framework that allowed for medicinal cannabis to be used for patients that received more benefit than detriment for the use of medicinal cannabis. And it was really at the time, as many of you in this area in San Francisco know, as a reaction to what was happening with an AIDS epidemic, where people that were looking at palliative care and end-of-life situations didn't have the ability to use something that was anecdotally shown to provide real benefit to a condition that they had, which was wasting syndrome. You know, it allowed them to eat when they weren't able to. And you know, smoking cannabis by comparison to Marinol, which was a pill that you'd have to swallow, and for people that couldn't keep food down, it wasn't really an option, whereas you could take 2 hits of a joint and receive the benefit you needed to prolong your ability to survive. In 1996, you know, we saw the major change happen, and soon after, in 1998, you saw other states such as Washington, Oregon follow suit, and then again in 2004, more states follow suit. But what happened after that, and you know, Ian actually talked about a bit of this in his presentation, so it's nice to go after him, is there was a bit of a perversion around the cannabis industry in so much as people followed a model in California that wasn't well codified. It didn't necessarily address a situation of, can we decide which compounds and in which ratios are best for specific ailments? So when you look at someone with coaxia that received immediate benefit, or someone that was going through chemotherapy that received immediate benefit from using cannabis, that was an easy decision to make. But when you start getting to ailments that are more specific in nature, whether it's Dravet syndrome or Lennox-Gastaut or other child onset epilepsies or MS or glaucoma, what you weren't seeing was formulations. And one of the things that someone that's been in the industry as long as I have is when you try to convince people in the medical community that there's medical benefit associated with cannabis, the first question they ask you is, okay, show me the empirical evidence, show me the double-blind studies, show me the clinical trials that have been done. And the answer that we've had as an industry, unfortunately, is that based on Schedule I status, we're unable to provide that information because it's the classic catch-22 of you can't do the studies on one side to show you the evidence on the other. So as a result, as many of us in this room know, it created a fiction that you could actually give them the information they wanted, and the reaction was always, well, then we can't support this. But in the last several years, we're watching a wholesale overhaul of the cannabis industry, and I think that for a long time, the mantra that I always subscribed to was cannabis is medicine. And I think that I would now amend that to really say cannabinoids are medicine. And where we are right now in the process is an interesting time, because you have states such as Pennsylvania that's about to sign their law. You've got New York, New Jersey, and Minnesota who have created very, very restrictive cannabis-based laws that are really trying to create a real medical model as opposed to a California model or Colorado or Washington or Oregon, where the ability to access medicinal cannabis doesn't really have that many gateways in place, which in many ways I have no problem with. But we have to think about this from the standpoint of, are we addressing the social issue of illegality and the social issue of incarceration and trying to make sure that people that are otherwise law-abiding citizens don't become arrested or have a criminal record or don't have access to student loans and all the other things that go along with illegality and prohibition? Or are we really trying to treat something from a medical standpoint that's specifically speaking to addressing an issue for a patient set? And where I've come out on this, and again, the last several years, for those of you that don't know what I do now with Tuatara Capital, is we are the single largest private equity fund that's based in the cannabis industry to dedicate capital directly into cannabis-based businesses. So over the last several years, I've acted as sort of the gateway of looking at every business plan that comes across our desk. I'm the first person to really go through and rip it apart and determine whether or not a business model is fundable, why it's fundable, which jurisdiction it's in, does it meet with the Cole memo, and does it meet with the guidelines set forth by the Treasury Department, the Judicial or Justice Department, and then really looking at whether or not, if it does meet the criteria that we're looking for, whether or not we think it's got legs. And in doing that, I can tell you that so many companies that directly touch the plant, I see the same thing over and over again. That's, we're the most medical you've ever seen. No one's as medical as we are. We've got new growing methodology. We've got better clean rooms. We've got we're able to we've got great separation technologies. We're employing supercritical and subcritical CO2. We're reducing things down to a clean oil. We're creating a fantastic product. What I never saw was we're creating a homogeneous product. We're creating a product that we can say with definitive certainty that the cannabinoid ratios that are within this product are consistent. So without naming any edibles companies, or when we think about some of the larger brands, these companies are still, for the vast majority of them, are buying their inputs from 30, 40, 50 different growers. They're buying trim from all these different people that are producing, and those growers might have 20 or 30 different strains that they're selling. And each one of those strains might be slightly different as far as what their genetic composition is, what the cannabinoid ratios are, and what the terpene and flavonoid profiles are as well. And so if you're a believer, as most people are, that the way to find medical efficacy in this plant is through an entourage effect of multiple cannabinoids along with the terpene and flavonoid profile, it's important to think about that and say, okay, well, that's great, but is there a consistent profile? And am I able to say with definitive certainty that not only am I getting 60 milligrams of THC in this product every time I use it, whether it's a granola bar, a sublingual strip, a transdermal patch, whatever it is that you want to use as your means of delivery of medicine, is that THC ratio consistent against the CBD, against the CBN, against the CBC? What is it that we're actually seeing inside this product that is working specifically toward the ailment or condition that I have? And I think as an experiment that we employed several times is try going into a dispensary and describe to the bud tender what it is that you have and ask for a recommendation of what it is they recommend that you use. And you'll get wildly varying answers to this question. And again, they might be able to say from the standpoint of sativa dominant or indica dominant what you're going to see as being more beneficial from their standpoint. But again, we're talking about really anecdotal evidence here. We're not talking about anything that you can actually take into the FDA and say, look, from our studies over the last 20 years, this is what we've found to be the greatest benefit for this specific condition. And that's where I think, what we're seeing happen, especially in this election cycle, we're at the moment where this is about to shift. And the reason that I'm up here talking about today is let's think about what the future of the legislative landscape is here in the United States. Currently we have 23 US states with medicinal cannabis laws in the books. Each of those laws is completely different. And then you've got 4 states right now that have adult use recreational. So when you think about what happened in Colorado, and again, Colorado in so many ways is the best laboratory or test subject to look at, you watched the vast majority of sales move away from medicinal and move towards adult use recreational. And the fact of the matter is there's still a really large patient subset in Colorado, but it's debatable about whether or not those people are still using their medical card to access cannabis because they believe in the medical efficacy of that specific product, or whether it's because it's at a lower tax rate or it's a lower price or they've got other benefits from the dispensary they purchase from that makes it more advantageous for them to remain a patient rather than be a recreational user. So if you look at the sales though, from 2014 until 2016, you've watched it go from this much medical and this much recreational to just shifting completely to the recreational side, which if you look at it objectively would suggest that the vast majority of people aren't necessarily using it as medicine. If they are, it's more therapeutic in nature than it is specifically medical in nature. And you're seeing the same thing happen with Washington's market of really moving Washington over to, in many ways eliminating the medical program in favor of an adult use recreational program. And then you look at what's happening this election cycle. Potentially California, Arizona, Nevada, Massachusetts, Maine, and Vermont are looking towards adult use recreational. Maine, I would say, is as well, but Maine's ballot certification 2 days ago fell short, so we'll see whether or not they win on the appeal. But if we see 11 states, including the largest populous state in the nation here in California, move to adult use recreational, Is that going to change the tide of what we look at in the medical program? And I would argue that it absolutely is, and that you're going to see the vast majority of people that were accessing cannabis for chronic pain or for, quote, any other condition that is deemed to have greater benefit than detriment. I think you'll see the vast majority of those people move towards an adult use recreational model. And I think you'll also see the research that's being conducted right now in places like Canada and in Israel and the Czech Republic and Spain really start migrating into the United States, where people are starting to do real studies around cannabinoids, not just cannabis. And as a to substantiate that, I don't know how many of you guys saw Merrill Lynch and Bank of America about 2 months ago actually put out the first analyst report specifically related to cannabinoid-based medications and what the potential, forward-thinking IPO market looks like around, the cannabis industry. And really, if you read the report closely, it wasn't saying we believe in the cannabis industry as a potential exit through IPO, but we are looking at the scientifically based cannabinoid industry as being a path forward that's really going to mimic and look like traditional biotech or traditional pharma. So when you start thinking about from a molecular level, right now everyone talks about THC and CBD, and if you want to go a little bit further, THC delta 8, THC delta 9, THCA, THCV, CBD are really the buzzwords right now, and that's where people are doing the greatest amount of research around where the benefit is found on a cannabinoid level. But that's largely because studying the other trace cannabinoids within the plant is near impossible because of the small amounts that occur naturally in the plant as you harvest it. So extracting CBD and extracting THC is substantially easier than extracting a lot of the other between 86 and 111, depending on who you speak to, the other trace cannabinoids. But as you start getting into the laboratory and away from a cultivation, you start thinking about what people are doing now, utilizing biocatalysis, or utilizing genetic coding to try to identify attributes and try to take those attributes and exploit them into determining what is working best. You're going to start seeing data subsets come out of this industry that will be so much more unique than what you're seeing now with companies that are saying, I'm producing a CBD oil to be used for treatment of epilepsy or treatment of other spasticity issues. So the industry right now is splitting. The adult use recreational market in many ways, and I know that there's probably many in this room that would argue with me on this, what we're seeing in California, what we see in Oregon, Washington, Colorado, the medicinal market as we know it today is essentially the recreational market of tomorrow. The vast majority of people that are accessing cannabis right now under the guise of medicinal will be making a transition over to just saying it is what it is. It's adult use recreational cannabis use. And it's not to say it doesn't have therapeutic benefit, it's not to say it doesn't have medicinal benefit, but it doesn't have medicinal benefit in the same manner that traditional medicine that has to go through FDA approval today is required of. So you're going to see bodies such as the FDA, such as the DEA, such as the National Institute of Health, really start making a push towards requiring more of the companies that are trying to produce medicinally based cannabinoid medicines. You're also going to see, as we all, I think in this room agree, a change from Schedule 1 to Schedule 2 on the Controlled Substances Act. And that's going to push all the studies that are being done around cannabis away from dispensaries and into traditional pathways. So for a lot of the people in this room that look at the CRARES Act or look at some of the other pending legislation on Capitol Hill and think that descheduling from Schedule 1 to Schedule 2 is the answer, I think that many people should take a look at and decide, what does Schedule 2 mean? Schedule 2 means that dispensaries as we know it today are no longer available to you to access medicine. Schedule 2, the very nature of it, means that it's a controlled substance that is deemed to have some medicinal benefit, but that medicinal benefit now has to be put through a pharmacist. You can no longer walk into a dispensary and say, I'm going to buy medicine here. So for all of those that think this is the cure-all, let's deschedule away from Schedule 1 to 2, 3, or 4, all of those still require pharmacies. Unless you talk about rescheduling completely off the Controlled Substances Act, and if you do that, again, now you're talking about adult use recreational. If you're talking about a Schedule 2 drug for medicinal, cannabis or cannabinoids, I don't care if you're talking about, THC, CBD, CBN, all the rest of them. If the DEA is still going to try to control cannabinoids in general and put it on a lower schedule, that lower schedule is going to require clinical trials. So going forward from a scientific scientific research-based approach, I think that it's really, really worth noting what's happening in other countries right now and what to expect out of the cannabis industry, literally from about 2016 to 2020. On the research and testing side, what's happening with the companies that are dealing with genetics, the companies that are looking at how to biosynthetically produce cannabinoids that, rather than, you look at a marinol or a drobanol, which is essentially a chemically based analog to THC, but actually, companies now that are doing it from a biology-based standpoint that are producing a cannabinoid that's identical in nature to what's produced in the plant. That's the future of cannabinoid and cannabis-based medicines. So as you're going into the industry, I look at everything from a standpoint as an investor. Where is it that we want to place our capital? Where is it that we want to find businesses that we think are long for the industry, that have exit strategies that allow our investors to see a really nice return on capital. And I would suggest that the bifurcation that's happening right now between medicinal and recreational is one that people should take a very close look at, because when you start looking at cannabis-based medicines that are going through DEA approval and FDA approval, you're now talking about insurance companies being able to do your medicines through copays. You're talking about chain of custody issues where you're never letting go of control of the medicine from the time it's being produced at a manufacturing organization all the way until the time it's on the shelf at a pharmacy. And I think that if you're interested in cannabis as medicine, I think, I got into this industry for one reason, and that's, I believe that cannabis is, the fact that we have something that's such an amazing plant that isn't able to be studied, that everyone in this room knows somebody that's received real benefit from the use of cannabis. If we truly believe in cannabis as medicine, then I think it's time that we start thinking about how do we address cannabis as medicine, and what's the pathway to start looking at cannabinoid-based approaches that are done in specific ratios, that are done in specific profiles, that are now going through data sets that allow us to go back to the same physicians that have laughed at our arguments for years. Even the gentleman that spoke against Ethan Nadelman yesterday, it's the same argument it always has. You guys can't prove what you're saying. And if we can actually get out there and start producing data sets that substantiate what it is that we've been believing for years, that's when we start seeing medical breakthroughs happen towards cancer, towards MS, towards Crohn's disease, towards glaucoma. And I'm not saying we're gonna cure all these things through the use of cannabis-based medications, but I am saying that we're gonna see real benefit from these, but it's gotta be done through the proper pathway. And the pathway that we know it today as cannabis-based medicines that are just extractions from a grow room, or even using flower or concentrates and calling that medicine, is something that we should be more honest as an industry and say that this is adult use recreational cannabis. And if that's what we want, great, then let's start voting for adult use recreational cannabis. But let's get away from the idea of saying that that's true medicine as we know it today. So again, I'd love to take some questions. It's a short presentation today, but we have some time? Great. So I'd love to open up to the floor. If anyone has questions on this, I'm happy to take them. Yes?
Can you comment about the expansion and growing need for concentrates and juicing?
Sure. So two different questions. On the juicing side, a lot of what we're seeing is the non-decarboxylated THCA that's involved in trying to do a whole plant reduction, and a lot of benefit being derived there. But again, no consistency on that side. Even if you've got the same strain and 10 different guys are growing it, you're going to get a different cannabinoid profile every time you do it, unless you're producing in a really large batch and then reducing it all down together in what I would consider to be a vintage rather than like a single barrel bourbon. Then you're not going to be able to say with definitive certainty what the expectation is of benefit, simply based on putting it through one lab test and saying, okay, this is what it is this time. The next time you do the same thing, it's not going to be the same. With concentrates, concentrates is a complicated issue, especially in California, depending on how you're making them. But from the standpoint of where I'm relating this to medicine, on the concentrate side, there's a real issue with regard to the levels of pesticide, the levels of heavy metals, the levels of residual solvents, everything that's bad in the cannabis plant that's grown, when you put it through an extraction process, those come out in much more concentrated levels. So having those negative concentrated levels of, let's call it E. coli, mold, mildews, all the rest of the things that you don't want in your plant, Now you've got to go through a secondary or tertiary distillation process or process of, sorry, I'm spacing on the word, but a secondary extraction on top of that to try to remove impurities. And there's some people, that are here today that have businesses that, are on this floor that I've seen in the last couple of days that have businesses that specifically try to do that secondary and tertiary distillation process to get rid of those impurities. But even at that point, unless you're taking it one or two steps past that and going through, a really expensive methodology using like a Waters machine to actually try to pull individual cannabinoids out, you're still not getting to the level of pharmaceutical purity that is going to be required of the FDA. Yes?
So if you were advising a medium-sized cultivator, you would say kind of move away from cannabinoid products and focus more on, a recreational type product as essentially the therapeutic market is disappearing?
Well, I think the therapeutic market actually is expanding. I don't think so. I think the therapeutic and the recreational market are going to be in many ways hand in hand because therapeutics and nutraceuticals in general don't have the same requirements that you have in pharmaceutical products. So if you're trying to market your product as something that has benefit towards helping you sleep at night or helping the same things you'd find out of melatonin or fish oil or some of the other products that are on the shelves today in GNCs and health food stores, I think mostly that's going to be produced by the recreational side of the market. I think that a lot of that's going to be large-scale commercial cultivations that are now going through extraction processes where people are blasting their entire harvest to come up with a product that they can put on the shelves there. But again, I think standardization is key. And I think if people are doing that, then the trend, once you're at the ability to produce in multiple acres in a greenhouse or in a row crop environment, then you can produce a vintage. You can say, I'm going to blast this entire harvest and make one product, and that one product I can test, call it 10,000 liters of liquid rather than batch by batch by batch, which is going to have a major deviation between each batch. So the therapeutics market, I don't think is going anywhere. I don't think the recreational market is going anywhere. I just think that if you're a medium-sized cannabis-based business that's going towards that market, I think it's important to stay away from using medical terms. If you look at what happened recently with some of the CBD companies that were making claims that they couldn't substantiate, they had letters sent to them saying, if you don't stop, we'll stop it for you. So be very careful about what language you use if you're looking towards the therapeutics or nutraceutical market. Yes?
So, say it gets reclassified Class 2.
Yes.
The FDA could take, hypothetically, 5 to 7 years to approve these drugs. What happens to the medical industry in that time?
Yeah, that's a great question. And it's one that Yeah, so the question, if you guys couldn't hear it in the back, was what would happen if Schedule 1 goes to Schedule 2? What would happen to the medical industry as we know it today, based on the fact that it could be 5 to 7 years' time before we actually see a wholesale change in how the FDA approves drugs and how the FDA, basically there's a period of latency between where we are today and where we would be after FDA approval. And that's the question. That is the big question out there, which is careful what you wish for on declassification. In some ways, the only thing that's keeping the medical industry alive as we know it today is federal illegality. If you move away from Schedule 1 and you move to a lower schedule, you're talking about instantaneous oversight that didn't exist before. I mean, we operate in a really interesting vacuum right now of a federal government that's taking a hands-off approach on what they consider to be a 10th Amendment experiment, right? So when you take that away and you say, okay, now we're going to put it into proper channels or standard channels that we've been using, very likely you lose a great deal of the medical industry as we know it today. But I do think that as more research is being done around cannabinoid-based medicines, obviously GW now is in phase 3 of 2 different drugs with Epidiolex and Sativex. Nemus Bioscience is working on a glaucoma medicine. You've got Insys, which has been working on medications. But I think most people in this room, we don't want to see everything go to big pharma. We don't. It's been an industry that we fought, exceptionally hard for over the last 20 years to get us to where we are today. To immediately hand that over to Pfizer and to Merck and Novartis, I don't think is something that we're prepared to do. So it's it's something that I think that needs to be well addressed, and it should be addressed by industry groups like the NCIA and MPP to really think that question out, because it's a dangerous move to just deschedule and say, okay, now what? Because it's not what people think it is. Yes.
So now that we have the science so that we can isolate all the cannabinoid crystals
Yes.
individually, and we can distill out and fraction out all of the 38 different terpenes.
Yep.
And people are harvesting terpenes from non-cannabis sources.
Mm-hmm.
And people are harvesting CBD from hemp.
Mm-hmm.
And people are now proposing to grow cannabinoids in yeast.
Yep.
Would you comment about the entourage effect for the origin of these chemicals and where you see them in the future?
First of all, a really well thought out question. Yeah, so you're watching companies like I believe it's Ibna out of Israel that's working with terpenes that is literally isolated every terpene that exists in the cannabis plant today. You're looking at on the biocatalysis with the yeast side. You're looking at companies like Anandia and Hyacinth and Liberty, who pitched last night, and CBC Biotechnologies, all going through experimentation of using yeast or using sucrose as a building block to put everything through an enzymatic process to produce pharmaceutically pure cannabinoids. And you're looking at flavonoid companies that largely have existed on the open market for years through the perfume industry. So from the standpoint of the entourage effect, I think that really comes down to the genetic coding of the plant. And I think that what we don't have today is consistency, even strain by strain, due to genetic drift. So you talk about someone that's growing Blue Dream in Northern California and someone that's growing Blue Dream in Vermont. And even if they started off with the same seed stock 15 years ago from the same grower that initially produced it in Amsterdam, let's say, what you're growing in those two different places could be completely different, genetically 15 years later, if they haven't, gone through the same methodology, or they're not, keeping everything in a tissue culture lab. So I think that what we're going to start seeing, and I think that there's a group, that's being formed here. I know that Steve Fox has his group in Colorado. I know, Todd Mitchum has his group. People are pushing for these standardization groups, and one of the standardization features you're going to see is specific to identification of strains and holding a strain database that that strain is that strain. As much as I hate to use the analogy, not much different than Monsanto. Let's actually identify a strain, say this is what it is, and unless it meets, the following 25 fingerprint profile tests, you can't call it that strain. Like, it's not Blue Dream unless you put it through the initial test and say, yeah, I've identified it as this, and from here on in, we'll only take genetics from a tissue culture lab to ensure against genetic drift. And once you have that, and you actually take what the genetic profile of that strain is and say, okay, it exhibits the following terpenoid profile and the following flavonoid profile and the following cannabinoid profile. At that point, then you can backtrack against it. Then you can take these cannabinoids produced from yeast, and you can take the terpenes that are produced in other places and flavonoids, and recreate an entourage effect that's bioequivalent. It's not there yet. It will be there. It's something that people are looking at, but we're probably 5 or 6 years away from that, and honestly, I don't think it's going to happen in the United States. I think it's going to happen elsewhere.
I like bioequivalent.
Yes. Yes.
Why can't these projects be considered like nutraceuticals, just considered as generally safe?
They should be. I mean, that's the.
Why would it have to be medicinal? Why can it not just be under the like a nutraceutical?
Well, I think a lot of the point of what I'm bringing here is that is where we are. If you want to call it a nutraceutical product or a therapeutic product, absolutely, I think that cannabis, today's medicinal cannabis, is on the therapeutic or nutraceutical side, and if that's what you want to characterize it as, I think that that's a very fair assessment. So when you are having these conversations in defense of what it is you're producing, you can say, yeah, there's a deviation between batch to batch, the same way that you go up to Napa and Silver Oak varies from year to year. It's even the same grapes or the same vines. Every year is going to have a different growing condition. The same way that your harvest room is going to have spikes in humidity and spikes in CO2, and your ppms are going to be different from batch to batch, and you're not ever going to produce the same product. But if you want to look at it from the standpoint of if you were to take the entire harvest down and then reduce it down to an oil, then theoretically the deviation should be a lot smaller than it would be flower to flower. I mean, even in the same plant, we know that you could be 24% THC at the top of the canopy and 14% at the bottom. Even if it's the same genetic code, you're gonna have a deviation. So if you want to call that therapeutic and say, yeah, I'm receiving benefit from the use of this product, by all means, I think that's the right characterization. But I think that when you start defending it as medicine to the medical community, it's a much different argument. All right. Well, thank you so much for coming out today. Again, I would ask all of you one more time, if you're not members and you don't support MPP, DPA, Students for Sensible Drug Policy, NCIA, find an organization in this industry that you support. Those guys are fighting for all of us in this room. So please, if you're willing to pay money to come to a conference, it costs a lot less to join one of those organizations. So please take the time to join one, please. Thank you.